Everybody calls the pike an aggressive fish. Ask any angler. Aggressive, mean, a water wolf. It's the first word anyone reaches for. I want to argue the exact opposite. A pike is one of the least aggressive predators in freshwater. Not because it's shy, because it can't afford to be aggressive. It cannot chase you down. It cannot outwork its prey. And the moment you understand why, you stop fishing for pike the way almost everyone does, and you start fishing for the one thing that actually gets you bit. Here's the reframe. A pike is not a hunter. A pike is a loaded weapon, a crossbow with fins, and there are 7 of them in the world. Not 8, not 5, 7, and every single one is the exact same weapon, built at a different scale, hidden in a different kind of water. Let me show you the machine first. Then I'll show you all 7, and by the end, how you catch every one of them is going to look completely different than it did 5 minutes ago. Start with the body, because the body gives the whole thing away. Look at a pike from the side, and notice where the fins are. The dorsal fin and the anal fin are shoved way back, almost on top of the tail. That is not a random design choice. Fish biologists have measured exactly what that does. By moving those fins to the very back of the body, the pike turns its entire rear third into one big paddle. When it fires, the tail and those 2 rear fins work together as a single surface, and lab studies of pike fast starts found that more than 90% of the forward thrust comes from that back third of the body. Think about what that means. The pike didn't build itself for cruising. It built itself for one thing, a single, violent forward launch. Engineers call it a fast start, and the northern pike is the textbook example. Scientists literally call it a fast start specialist. It's the fish every study reaches for when they want to understand explosive acceleration in water. And the numbers are genuinely hard to believe. When researchers wired up pike with tiny accelerometers and filmed them striking prey, the feeding lunges hit accelerations around 13 times the force of gravity, 13 G. For comparison, a fighter pilot starts blacking out somewhere around 9. The pike does this from a dead stop, in water, which is 800 times denser than air. But here's the part that reframes everything. That strike is a one-shot weapon. The muscle powering it is white muscle. Fast, powerful, and it burns fuel without oxygen. That's what makes it explosive. It's also what makes it useless for endurance. When scientists measured the power coming out of that muscle during a strike, it was running right up against the theoretical ceiling for what vertebrate muscle can physically produce. There is almost no more performance to give. The pike is firing at the absolute limit of biology, and then it's spent. So a pike literally cannot chase. If the first shot misses, there is no second wind. It has to reload, which means it has to rest. Which is exactly why the pike does something most predators don't. It doesn't run its prey down, it sneaks. Lab studies watched northern pike stalk a target and close the gap to within 1/3 to 1/2 of their own body length before they fire. Let that sink in. A 3-foot pike wants to be about a foot away, sometimes less, before it commits. It's not a chase. It's an ambush at point-blank range. And it holds. Before the strike, the pike bends its body into a slow S shape and just sits in that curve, sometimes for seconds. That S is the drawn bowstring. The body is literally cocked, storing the geometry it needs, waiting for the prey to drift into the kill zone. Then it releases the curve, the rear paddle snaps, and the whole animal launches. So now flip all of that around and look at it from the end of your line. Every single thing that frustrates pike anglers stops being mysterious. Why do pike live jammed into weed edges, wood, and cover? Because the weapon only works from ambush. Open water is useless to a fish that can't chase. The cover isn't where the pike hides. The cover is the firing position. Why is the strike so shockingly violent? Why does it feel like your lure got hit by a truck? Because you're not feeling a bite. You're feeling a weapon discharge. 13 G of stored biology hitting your bait at point-blank range. And why does a big pike fight like a demon for 15 seconds and then come in like a wet log? Because that white muscle already spent itself. It fought you the only way it knows how, one explosive burst, and then the tank was empty. Here's the payoff, the thing I want you to actually take to the water. You are not fishing for a fish that's swimming around looking for food. You're fishing for a loaded weapon sitting in a firing position, waiting for a trigger. Your job is not to cover water hoping to bump into a hungry pike. Your job is to put a believable target through the kill zone, close to cover, at a speed and angle that pulls the trigger. That's it. That's the whole game. And it's the same game for all 7 species. What changes is the size of the weapon and the water it's loaded into. So let's walk the 7. Same machine, 7 scales. Number 1, the northern pike, Esox lucius. This is the baseline weapon, the one every other pike is a variation on. It lives across the entire northern half of the planet, North America, Europe, Asia. One continuous ring around the top of the world. In North America, it'll push past 20 pounds and 40+ inches. In Europe, it gets bigger still. Green flanks, pale bean-shaped spots, that duckbill jaw full of teeth. Fish it as what it is, an ambush weapon in mid-sized water. Weed edges, points, the seam where cover meets open water, current breaks in a river. Big spoons, spinnerbaits, glide baits, jerk baits. In cold water, slow down and let a suspending bait hang in the kill zone, because a cold pike won't reload fast and won't commit to a hard chase. In warm shallows, speed it up and trigger the reaction, but always remember you're presenting past a firing position, not searching open water. And use a leader, always, because the entire front of this animal is engineered around a bite. Number 2, the muskellunge, Esox masquinongi, the muskie. This is the weapon maxed out, the biggest member of the genus, 30 to 50 inches of it, with fish approaching 70 pounds on record. And musky anglers have a phrase for it that tells you everything, the fish of 10,000 casts. Now here's where the crossbow model earns its keep, because musky fishing hands you the single best proof of the whole theory. Ask any musky angler about the follow. A muskie will track your lure all the way to the boat and just escort it. Won't hit, sits behind it, staring. Anglers lose their minds over this, but the crossbow explains it perfectly. The follow means the trigger never fired. The weapon is loaded. The fish is right there, committed, interested, but it never got the geometry it needed to release the shot. A big muskie wants to fire at a specific angle, at a specific closing speed, ideally with the prey turning or fleeing. A lure swimming in a dead straight line to the boat never gives it that moment. So what did musky anglers invent to fix it? The figure 8. At the end of every retrieve, you drop the rod tip and sweep the lure through a big, deep figure 8 beside the boat. And people catch enormous fish this way, boat side, in 3 feet of water. Why does it work? Because the turns finally give the weapon its trigger, a target changing direction and speed inside the kill zone. The figure 8 wasn't dreamed up as a gimmick. It was reverse engineered, over decades, from the exact firing behavior we just measured in the lab. Every musky angler doing a figure 8 is, whether they know it or not, feeding a loaded crossbow the geometry it's been waiting for. Number 3, the chain pickerel, Esox niger. Take the same weapon, shrink it, and drop it into small, dark, weedy water, ponds, swamps, tannic creeks, slow backwaters. A good chain pickerel is a 2-foot fish, and it will hit a lure hard enough to make you swear you hooked a giant. That's not the fish being oversized, that's the weapon being undersized, but built to the exact same spec. Full power burst, point blank, no restraint. Fish it more precise, not more powerful. Small jerkbaits, inline spinners, compact swim baits, right against pads, wood, and grass lines. Accuracy beats distance every time, because the pickerel is firing from close range and won't move far to chase. Lighter tackle makes it a blast, but keep the bite protection, because scaled down or not, the teeth are still the whole point of the animal. Number 4, and here's where I have to correct the internet, including a lot of pike species videos you'll find on this platform. You'll see lists that count 8 pike species, and they get there by splitting the redfin pickerel and the grass pickerel into 2. They are not 2 species, they are 2 subspecies of one species, the American pickerel, Esox americanus. The redfin, Esox americanus, lives along the Atlantic slope and wears those namesake reddish fins. The grass pickerel, Esox americanus vermiculatus, lives farther west through the Mississippi and Great Lakes drainages. Where their ranges overlap, they interbreed so freely that biologists say you often can't tell which one you're holding. You just call it an American pickerel and move on. 2 subspecies. 1 species. That's the honest count, and it's the difference between reading a fish and reciting a list. As a fish, it's the weapon miniaturized to its smallest form, usually under a foot, rarely past 14 inches, living in ditches, marshes, and skinny vegetated water most anglers walk right past. And here's the beautiful part. When scientists describe how this tiny pickerel attacks, it's the same script: ease toward the prey, curl the body, then release into the fastest acceleration it can produce. A 6-inch fish running the identical program as a 50-inch muskie. Same weapon. Same firing sequence, different scale. To catch one, go tiny and go shallow. Ultralight tackle, small spinners, micro jerkbaits, a live minnow under a float tucked right against cover. You can catch these in water 2 feet deep, sometimes less. Number 5. The Amur pike. Esox reichertii. This is the northern pike's closest relative, its sister species, living clear over in Asia, in the Amur River basin on the Russia-China border and on Sakhalin Island. Silvery body, small black spots instead of pale ones, and it grows big, past 40 inches. Same weapon, same ambush life, just wearing Asian colors. Now, why should an American angler care about a fish from the Amur River? Because we tried to make it ours. In the 1960s, Pennsylvania actually stocked Amur pike into a lake, and stocked northern pike crossed with Amur hybrids too, trying to build a new trophy fishery. It failed, the pure Amur pike never established, and today it's almost certainly gone from those waters. But it's a real piece of American fisheries history, and it tells you how badly managers wanted another version of this weapon in their water. Number 6. The southern pike. Esox cisalpinus. And this one is a genuine plot twist, because for about 150 years, nobody knew it existed. Anglers in central and northern Italy, southern France, and Switzerland were catching what everyone assumed were northern pike. Same body, same ambush, same violent strike. Just a local color pattern, people figured. Then in 2011, 2 separate research teams ran the genetics, and it wasn't a northern pike at all. It was a distinct species that had been hiding in plain sight inside the name northern pike for a century and a half. They even named it twice in the same year, independently. The name that got printed first, Esox cisalpinus, is the one that stuck. Think about that the next time you're sure you know exactly what you're holding. An entire species of pike went unrecognized in one of the most heavily fished regions on Earth, because it looked close enough. Number 7. The Aquitanian pike, Esox aquitanicus. The newest one, only described in 2014, from the rivers of southwestern France. Its genetics diverge from the northern pike by around 4%, a real, measurable split, not a color phase. And it exists for the same reason the southern pike does. Rivers isolate populations, isolation drives them apart, and given enough time, you don't get a variant of the weapon, you get a whole new model of it. For the angler, the Aquitanian pike and the southern pike carry the same practical lesson. You fish them exactly like any pike: cover, edges, ambush, trigger. But they're a reminder that pike is not one fish stamped out across the world. It's a design so successful that evolution keeps rerunning it, river by river, region by region, quietly building new versions we're only now learning to tell apart. So there they are, 7 species, and I hope you can already feel the point landing. The species list was never the interesting part. The interesting part is that they're all the same answer to the same problem. So let me put the whole thing back together, because this is what I actually want you to carry to the water. Forget the idea that you're fishing for a pike, some roaming, aggressive fish you have to hunt down. You're not. You are fishing for a loaded weapon, sitting in a firing position, waiting for one thing: a trigger. Everything follows from that. Find the firing positions first, the cover, the edges, the ambush points, because a pike in open water is a weapon with nothing to shoot at. Once you've found the position, your only job is to run a believable target through the kill zone, close, at a speed and angle that pulls the trigger. If a fish follows and won't commit, You didn't fail to interest it. The weapon was loaded the whole time. You just never gave it the geometry. So change the angle, change the speed, give it a reason to fire. That's the figure 8, and it works far beyond musky. Match the weapon to the water. Big weapon, big water. Musky and northern pike gear, big presentations. Small weapon, small water. A pickerel in a ditch wants a precise cast and a downsized bait, not a bomb thrown across the pond. And whatever the scale, respect the front end of the animal, because every pike from a 6-inch grass pickerel to a 50-inch muskie is a fish whose entire evolutionary story is written around the bite. The leader is not optional. It's the one part of your rig that acknowledges what this fish actually is. Most anglers spend years thinking of pike as moody, aggressive, unpredictable. They're none of those things. They're consistent. They're mechanical. They're a crossbow that's been refined for millions of years and scaled into 7 bodies. And once you see the weapon instead of the fish, you stop guessing, and you start fishing the trigger. That's the lens. Take it to the water and watch how differently the whole thing reads.